The emergency convocation chamber of the Spiral Concord had been built to make every delegate feel small, but the Zethkai had always treated it as a stage built for them alone. Tier upon tier of stone metal balconies arced beneath a suspended model of the galactic core, each ring marked by species sigils, trade compacts, and old ceasefire scars. The Zethkai delegation stood without seats at all, as if refusing furniture were an argument. Their armor was ceremonial warplate, black lacquer over bone-white rank lines, and every motion carried the same message. Hierarchy was not a preference. It was physics. High Commander Carl stood at the center dais and began his address with no greeting. "For 6,000 cycles," he said, his scaled crest lifting as his voice rolled through translation fields, "the Zethkai bloodline fleets have imposed order where chaos bred vermin states. We ended pirate confederacies, culled pathogen species, and corrected unstable breeding cultures that mistook population for civilization. We now face a fresh contamination in this chamber. Humanity requests treaty parity despite lacking line purity, caste continuity, and hereditary command coherence. Their genotype is not a lineage, but accumulation. Their social structure rewards improvisation over rank legitimacy. Their legal claims rest on sentiment and numerical clutter. This is not sovereignty. This is biological graffiti painted over institutions built by disciplined minds." Murmurs moved through the chamber in dozens of frequencies. The keepers of Null lowered their frilled brows in disapproval. The merchants of Pax withdrew tactile antennae, a gesture of discomfort. 3 neutral blocks remained still, calculating market exposure if the speech became policy. Carl continued, enjoying the silence he had manufactured. "The Concord has tolerated human expansion because diluted cultures burn quickly. We expected internal fracture. We expected resource collapse. Instead, through procedural manipulation and alliance bribery, they secured corridor administration and protectorate mandates meant for species with proven civilizational depth. We request immediate review of all human treaties and suspension of equal status clauses pending genetic legitimacy audit." The phrase genetic legitimacy audit struck the chamber like a cold instrument. Everyone understood what it meant inside Zethkai doctrine. Populations that failed audits did not receive correction grants. They received disappearance paperwork. At Ring 7, the human delegation remained seated until the chamber steward granted floor response. Their representative was Envoy Olivia Barrett, gray uniform without ornament, hair pinned tight at the neck, hands folded as if at a budget hearing rather than a species trial. Beside her sat Admiral Elena Hayes as military observer, expression unreadable, and legal attaché, Marcus Cooper with a stack of old treaty codices already tabbed in 4 languages. Before Barrett could stand, Carl turned directly toward her and lifted one armored hand. "Do not recite your usual appeals to cooperation," he said. "Today, we test honesty. One question, human envoy, before every witness and every archived feed. What does your kind fear most?" He smiled with open contempt, a predator offering mercy in public so the refusal could be framed as ingratitude. The chamber leaned in. Delegates who had ignored humans for decades now watched with predatory curiosity. If she answered with weakness, the Zethkai had justification for pressure. If she answered with defiance, Carl had pretext for punitive demonstrations. The trap was obvious because it was designed to be obvious. Olivia Barrett stood. She looked at Carl, then at the ring of neutral species, then at the dead center lens of the Concord archive feed. She said nothing. The audio translators hissed softly, searching for a signal that never came. 30 seconds passed. 1 minute. 4. Carl's smile hardened. He expected anger, pleading, rhetoric, anything he could dismantle into spectacle. Barrett remained still, breathing evenly, eyes level. Admiral Hayes did not move beside her. Marcus Cooper closed his codex and waited. At 7 minutes, Carl laughed into his own microphone. "Observe," he said to the chamber. "Their myth of composure is vacuum. They cannot answer because they cannot define themselves. Primitive clusters survive by noise. Remove noise, and there is no core." He issued a formal motion to suspend human equal vote pending review. Pending. The motion failed by a narrow margin, but only because 2 minor blocks abstained rather than oppose him directly. Procedurally, humanity kept its status. Politically, everyone understood the vote had marked a fracture line. The convocation adjourned. The transmission remained open by Concord custom during emergency deliberation windows. The human feed stayed active, camera fixed on the now empty Ring 7 seats, as if waiting for words that never came. By the 12th hour, commentary channels across the inner lanes began treating the silence as concession. By the 20th, Zeth Kai military papers referred to it as tacit acknowledgement of inferiority. By the end of day 1, Carl's office released a triumphant memorandum promising orderly reintegration of unstable protectorates. On day 2, neutral insurers raised risk multipliers on human corridor routes. Freight guilds rerouted around Earth-administered stations. Zeth Kai patrol groups pushed closer to demilitarized markers and logged the movement as customs verification. No official declaration had been made, but pressure had already changed shape. On day 3, Carl addressed the Concord Press Gallery in full campaign plate. "The human silence confirms what discipline has always known," he declared. "They fear hierarchy because they cannot survive it. We will provide correction. We will restore proper rank geometry in frontier zones and remove diluted command nodes that endanger lawful trade. This is not conquest. This is sanitation." He ended by ordering all channels to preserve the convocation exchange as evidence of primitive bluffing under stress. The phrase spread quickly because it was short, cruel, and useful to people who preferred certainty over nuance. In Earth-Luna Strategic Command, nobody watched the commentary loops anymore. They watched freight vectors, relay permissions, and life support inventories in Protectorate hospitals. Admiral Elena Hayes stood at the main operations table in a room lit by tactical projections and the pale curve of Earth through armored glass. She had the kind of face that made junior officers lower their voices without being asked. Her hair was cut regulation short, threaded with silver at the temples, and her hands rested flat on the table while reports compiled around her. She had attended the convocation as observer because Earth's cabinet expected theater. She had returned knowing theater was over. Defense Minister Daniel Morrison entered with Intelligence Director Marcus Cooper and Ambassador Olivia Barrett 5 hours after the 3rd-day press briefing. None of them looked tired in the careless way of civilians. They looked controlled in the practiced way of people who had learned to postpone fatigue until policy stabilized. Morrison spoke first. "Confirm final status." Cooper expanded a lattice of system maps. Zeth Kai strike group concentrations are no longer speculative. 3 bloodline flotillas moved within launch range of corridor stations, Kestrel, Nadir Gate, and Oathline. Gene-locked disruption buoys have been seated at 2 approach vectors. Their doctrine assumes localized command paralysis if senior officers are cut. Hayes nodded once. "They still think decapitation works on us." "It works on them," Cooper said. "Their simulations mirror themselves." Olivia Barrett removed her convocation badge and placed it on the table beside Carl's transcript. "He wanted fear as language. We gave him time instead." Morrison looked at her. "Concord response?" "Fragmented and predictable," she said. The Valerii submitted quiet legal queries about protectorate obligations. The scholars of Lum sent encrypted concern and asked whether evacuation corridors remained valid. Former neutrals are waiting for somebody else to move first. They will not resist Zeth-Kai coercion unless we force them to choose between law and irrelevance. Hayes tapped the map, and new overlays appeared. Fuel depots, repair docks, emergency shelters, shipping co-ops, treaty annotations dating back 2 centuries. Human infrastructure webs looked mundane until viewed at Concord scale. Then they looked like deliberate architecture. "We are not contesting a single battle line," Hayes said. "We are contesting assumptions. If they expect centralized panic, they get distributed continuity. If they expect us to abandon civilians for fleet integrity, they get rescue swarms with independent fire authority. If they expect neutrals to close ports under threat, they discover how many of those ports run on contracts we wrote." Morrison gave a thin, humorless smile. "Polite contracts." "Enforceable contracts," Barrett corrected. A colonel at the comm station turned from her screen. "Minister, Zeth-Kai public channels are replaying the convocation again. Carl is promising Earth will kneel before the next Concord session." Morrison did not glance up. "Archive it with full metadata. We will need the sequence intact." That sentence drew a brief look from Cooper. He had spent 15 years building the Strategic Archive Authority, a quiet institution most citizens associated with education grants and war memorial curation. In closed rooms, it served another purpose. It collected verified atrocity records across languages and legal frameworks indexed for tribunals that did not yet exist. "Authority is ready," Cooper said carefully. "If Cabinet authorizes release thresholds, we can initiate phased dissemination through subject world channels the moment hostilities are undeniable." Hayes met his gaze. "No rumor payloads." "Verified only," he said. "Every frame authenticated. Every grave registry cross-confirmed." Olivia Barrett folded her hands the same way she had in the Concord chamber. "Good. We are not writing propaganda. We are restoring memory where fear erased it." 3 days of public silence had looked like humiliation to those who believed power announced itself immediately. Inside Human Command, silence had been a loading operation measured in shipping permits, hospital berths, legal triggers, and synchronized clocks. Captains received sealed contingency packets that opened only if relay hierarchies failed. Colony militias were issued authority trees that did not require flagship approval. Diplomats activated dormant clauses guaranteeing emergency refuel rights in neutral systems that had forgotten those clauses existed. By the first week after the convocation, supply forecasts for 37 protectorates shifted from brittle to sustainable. By the second, evacuation drill compliance reached 91% in corridor schools and trade habitats. The work was procedural, unglamorous, and relentless. Late in the cycle, after Morrison departed for cabinet session, Hayes remained with Barrett on the dimmed command deck while Earth turned below them. Neither woman pretended this could still be contained by speech. Barrett broke the quiet first. He asked what we fear most. Hayes watched the tactical projection update one more time. "I know." Barrett's voice stayed steady. He thought fear was an answer. Hayes finally looked at her, steel blue eyes reflecting orbit lines and incoming threat vectors. "Fear is a tool. Memory is a doctrine." On the 4th day, humanity transmitted a single broadcast to every Concord channel, every neutral relay, every Zeth-Kai command net willing or unwilling to receive it. It was brief, formal, and delivered without raised voice. "For 2 centuries we have been courteous. We hoped you would choose restraint. You chose eradication. Withdraw from occupied protectorates, end your genetic purges, and return civilian captives within 72 hours. The warning reached Carl while he stood beneath the Concorde's central HoloLens, still surrounded by commentators who had arrived to witness a surrender speech. The translated human statement scrolled once in white text, then again in Zeth-Kai script by automatic treaty protocol. For a span of seconds, the chamber finally gave him what he had demanded from Olivia Barrett: silence. Carl broke it with a laugh that carried cleanly through every active feed. For 2 centuries, they have been tolerated, he said, turning slowly so each delegate ring received the full performance. Tolerance is not equality. Courtesy is not legitimacy. Now they issue ultimatums to a bloodline civilization whose fleets wrote navigational law while their species still scavenged atmosphere shelters. Let this be recorded. Humanity has confused procedural access with sovereign authority. We reject their deadlines, we reject their accusations, and we reject the claim that mixed stock may judge ordered civilizations. In 72 hours, their demand expires. In less than 72, their corridors will. He lifted a clawed hand and signaled his adjutant. Transmit campaign directive, red geometry. Corridor stations Kestrel, Nadir Gate, and Oathline are to be placed under corrective occupation. Gene-lock disruption fields are authorized for command suppression. Boarding rights are unrestricted against uniformed and auxiliary resistance. Civilian containment assets will be cataloged for labor redistribution pending genetic review. At Ring 11, a Valeri observer stood and demanded procedural objection rights. Carl did not even look toward him when he answered. Your species remains under tariff accommodation through Zeth-Kai protected lanes, he said. File whatever moral language your archives require. Move a single escort ship into this matter and that accommodation ends. The Valeri sat down. 2 rings higher, the scholars of Lum requested an emergency legal interpretation from Concorde clerks on protectorate seizure thresholds. The clerks delayed for 6 minutes, then reported that no tribunal quorum could convene under active military motion. It was technically correct and politically useless. Olivia Barrett watched all of it from Earth-Luna Strategic Command on a wall-sized relay. The chamber's sound flattened into clinical fidelity. She said nothing through Carl's declaration, through the objections, through the visible collapse of neutral nerve. Only when the feed cut to military traffic did she speak. They are moving before their own deadline, she said. Admiral Elena Hayes stood at the operations table with both hands behind her back, eyes on the 3 flashing route vectors spreading across the projection. He needed the clock for theater, not strategy. Defense Minister Daniel Morrison read the incoming telemetry and gave the order everyone in the room already knew he would give. Set condition Iron Harbor on all protectorate nodes. Activate civilian extraction lanes and modular escort authority. If they cross marker lines, we treat this as an aggressive war under Concorde Article 84 and Human Emergency Statute. Marcus Cooper touched a control and a narrower window opened beside the tactical map. Verified manifests of prison transports, gene cast registries, sterilization directives seized by intelligence teams over the last decade. He did not enlarge it yet. We have legal trigger at first hostile contact, he said. Archive authority can begin phased release the moment weapons fire is confirmed and timestamped. Hayes gave one short nod. No speculative packets. None, Cooper said. Only authenticated records. 19 minutes later, a Zeth-Kai Vanguard crossed Kestrel's demilitarized marker and deployed 3 disruption buoys without hailing traffic control. At Nadir Gate, they arrived behind civilian freight columns and declared emergency quarantine to force a traffic lock. At Oathline, they fired warning lances across the station's solar collectors cutting power to outer habitat rings and forcing life support onto reserve. On the public Concord channels, Carl released a second statement with ceremonial contempt sharpened into doctrine. Observe discipline correcting disorder. Human-managed corridors were always administrative theft. We are not waging war on a people. We are restoring rank legitimacy to zones captured by procedural parasites. Any species currently sheltering under human protectorate claims has two choices: submit to review and survive under lawful hierarchy, or resist and be processed as collaborators in biological fraud. The wording was deliberate. Collaborator classification permitted seizure, transfer, and disappearance under old imperial codes that most of the Concord had politely pretended not to read. Barrett turned from the feed toward Hayes. He crossed every line in one broadcast. Hayes did not blink. Then, we stop speaking as if he has not. She keyed the command net herself, voice calm enough that bridge crews from Earth, orbit to outer relay barges later said the message sounded like routine scheduling. All task groups, this is Admiral Hayes. Zeth Kai forces have initiated hostile operations against human-administered protectorates. Execute Lantern Grid immediately. Primary objective is civilian preservation and extraction. Secondary objective is containment of boarding assets. Command continuity is fully distributed under mesh protocols. You are authorized independent action within rule set Black Harbor. Confirm. Buy burst and move. Confirmation lights populated the table in silent sequence, not from admirals first, but from station medics, tug captains, reserve corvette crews, militia coordinators, and diplomatic escorts. The map became a living fabric of small permissions turning into force. Morrison looked from Hayes to Barrett, then to Cooper. That is our response. No escalation speeches, no theatrics. We hold people alive. Barrett placed Carl's first convocation transcript beside the live tactical feed, one hand resting on the paper as if steadying something older than this war. He asked what we fear most. He is about to find out what we refuse. By the time the first breach alarm sounded at Kestrel, the decision had already hardened into policy across 37 systems. Humanity would not retreat to core worlds. Humanity would not trade peripheral civilians for strategic convenience. Humanity would not centralize command where a single decapitation strike could satisfy enemy doctrine. They would break into swarms, keep talking even when relays died, and treat each corridor habitat as if Earth itself depended on it. Hayes gave the final order that ended any remaining ambiguity. Record this across all command logs. The corrective campaign is recognized as extermination doctrine in motion. We respond in full. Strike Prefect Terran Rel of the Zeth Kai 7th Bloodline watched Kestrel Station through the forward assault screens and saw exactly what he had been promised. Confusion. The station's transponder IDs multiplied and overlapped as freighters broke queue, maintenance drones scattered from guide rails, and local security channels flooded with civilian distress calls. Rel tapped his gauntlet against the command rail and felt a satisfied rhythm settle into his chest plates. Suppress command nodes, he told his tactical officer. Do not waste heavy lances on habitat shells. We need compliance, not debris. The officer dipped his crest. Disruption boys report successful gene lock penetration on 3 identified leadership clusters. Rel almost pitied the humans then. Their crews had never understood inherited rank architecture. Remove hereditary command anchors, and their improvised social webs would tangle themselves to death. He opened an external channel and sent the formal conquest script. Kestrel administrative personnel. Your station is under corrective occupation by mandate of High Commander Carl. Power down all defensive systems, assemble command staff for genetic verification, and prepare civilian registries for transfer processing. Resistance will be cataloged as contamination behavior and punished accordingly. The reply came from a voice he could not classify by age or rank, human and unshaken. Kestrel Control acknowledges unlawful seizure attempt. Civilian evacuation is underway. Boarding parties will be contested. Medical corridors are marked in blue and are non-combatant protected under Concord law. Interfere with them, and your officers are personally liable. Rel clicked his inner jaw in disbelief. Liable. He gave the boarding signal. 6 assault cutters detached from his cruiser in disciplined wedges, magnetic clamps primed, breaching torches armed. On his display, Kestrel's outer defensive fire looked thin, mostly point defense bursts from craft too small to matter. A textbook collapse. Then the pattern shifted. The small craft multiplied. Cargo tugs shed container pods that unfolded into armored lifeboat lattices. Utility skiffs that should have fled instead snapped into escort arcs around evacuation strings. 2 vessels Rel had tagged as refinery tenders vented ballast and revealed spinal mass driver rails beneath civilian plating. None of them waited for flagship instruction. They moved as if the whole station shared one distributed mind. "Where is their command ship?" Rel asked. His operations officer scanned, hesitated. No singular signature. Multiple authority keys active simultaneously. That should not have worked. Not at this speed, not under disruption fields. Yet the boarding telemetry turned sour within minutes. Cutter 1 breached a cargo spindle and lost contact after 19 seconds. Cutter 2 entered a maintenance trunk and reported resistance from non-standard security teams before its feed died in static and sparks. Cutter 3 managed to seize a corridor junction, transmitted visual of human responders in mixed uniforms, then went dark when bulkhead shutters trapped the squad between counter-rotating decks. Rel snarled and ordered reserve Marines forward. On the side screens, civilian evacuation traffic kept moving, disciplined and infuriatingly orderly, each convoy bracketed by small human escorts that fought only when threatened and resumed extraction the moment a lane opened. 3 hours into the assault, Kestrel should have been kneeling. Instead, Rel had lost 4 cutters, 200 Marines, and every predictive model his academy had called universal. Then a second report arrived from Nadir Gate. Prefect, Nadir Strike Group requests immediate fuel relay. Neutral dockmasters denied service under dormant treaty language invoked by human diplomatic authority. Repair access revoked in 3 adjacent systems. Rel stared at the transmission. Denied by neutrals? On what basis? Emergency refuge clauses. Contract signatures traced to human infrastructure guarantor agencies. Clauses were activated within minutes of hostilities. He turned to communications. Patch me to High Commander Carl. The channel opened in compressed priority mode. Carl's face lit by command bridge red. Report, Carl said. Rel kept his voice formal despite the rising heat in his throat. Kestrel is contested but manageable. Resistance is decentralized beyond expected parameters. Civilian extraction has not collapsed. Additional concern. Neutral port compliance is degrading under human treaty triggers, affecting logistics for all corridor strike groups. Carl's crest flattened, the closest he came to visible anger on open line. You are speaking to me about paperwork while holding tactical superiority. With respect, High Commander, this is not paperwork. Their contracts are functioning as strategic interdiction. Carl cut him off. Then, take complete control of the station and fabricate your own logistics from captured stores. You were bred for conquest, not complaint. Every surviving human transmission from that corridor must carry one message by cycle end. Hierarchy restored. The line closed. Rel returned his attention to the battle space and found it worse. Oathline reported similar resistance. Boarding losses mounted. Human militia identifiers changed every 40 minutes as local crews rotated command keys through distributed meshes. No panic burst. No surrender pleas. No request for ceasefire terms. At Kestrel, his Marines finally secured one docking spine long enough to transmit body cam records before extraction. The footage showed corridors full of smoke and emergency strobes, human responders dragging wounded from both species toward marked medical bays while still firing controlled bursts at advancing boarders. The last clear audio from Sergeant Corral, seconds before feed loss, was a sentence that circulated through Zethkai Command by dark irony before anyone realized it was becoming a pattern. They do not break formation. They do not panic. They do not argue. 18 hours after first contact, Hayes stood again in Earth-Luna Strategic Command with fresh casualty columns and evacuation tallies rising in parallel. The cost was real. So was the outcome. Kestrel still held. Nadir's civilians were moving. Oathline's outer ring had power restored through improvised grid links run by engineering crews who had never trained together before that day. Cooper stepped beside her and quietly opened the archive window to full scale. Hostility threshold is met in every legal framework. Ready for release. Barrett arrived from diplomatic relay, face drawn but steady. Valerii and Lum just transmitted formal recognition of unlawful occupation. They will not send warships, but they will honor refugee docking rights and evidentiary carriage. Hayes exhaled once, almost a laugh, almost grief. Carl wanted us isolated. He is getting witnesses. She looked at the map, where dozens of small human icons kept moving through fire to pull strangers out alive. Begin Phase 2, she said. Release the archives. Cooper did not acknowledge the order with ceremony. He touched the authorization pad, entered 3 rotating keys, and watched the Strategic Archive Authority switch from passive custody to live transmission. Across the command wall, red icons became amber as packet clusters left Earth-Luna through diplomatic relays, medical beacons, insurance channels, freight arbitration nets, and old educational repositories that had been waiting years for this exact legal threshold. Every file carried provenance chains, casualty rosters, geotagged burial scans, and command signatures from Zethkai officers who had treated extermination policy as routine administration. Hayes kept her eyes on the tactical map while the first confirmations returned. Priority routing? Subject worlds first, Cooper said. Then neutral legal chambers. Then all Concord public archives with immutable checksum mirrors. If Carl tries to frame this as fabrication, he has to disprove his own officer seals in 12 languages. Barrett stood beside the operations rail, listening to evacuation traffic layered beneath intelligence bursts. Do not push commentary, just records. That was the plan from the start, Cooper said. No rhetoric, just memory with timestamps. At Kestrel, the immediate surprise had nothing to do with weapon yield. It was coherence. Zethkai doctrine had budgeted for heroic local resistance followed by command fragmentation once disruption fields severed senior authority. Instead, station defense became more precise each time a node took damage. A disabled traffic marshal platform handed control to a tug union dispatcher. When that dispatcher went offline, routing authority shifted to a habitat school administrator whose emergency certification had been filed 2 years earlier under a clause Carl's staff had mocked as bureaucratic clutter. Fire control permissions moved through the same mesh in narrow, audited bursts, so no single strike could blind the whole network. Strike Prefect Terran Rel watched his screens fill with human call signs that never repeated long enough for clean targeting. Identify command chain, he snapped. His operations officer answered with visible strain. There is no stable chain. Authority appears contextual and rotating. Medical leads are issuing navigation orders. Civilian pilots are assigning interception vectors. Station legal clerks are validating weapons locks under Concord emergency language before tactical crews fire. Rel stared at her. Legal clerks. Yes, Prefect. Their weapons are not firing until their legal mesh confirms protected lanes. That delay should weaken them. It is not. On Kestrel's Dock Spine 4, Lieutenant Anna Kowalski of the Corridor Militia received a burst packet with 5 signatures. A surgeon, a freight navigator, a municipal judge, a retired Navy engineer, and a 16-year station systems charter signed by Earth that granted emergency combat authority to any certified rescue coordinator when civilian routes were obstructed by hostile force. She looked once at the corridor feed, where Zethkai boarders were massing near a sealed pediatric ward, now empty because the evacuation had already moved on, and transmitted her request in 12 words. Need lock on spine 4. Rotation axle. Non-lethal disablement preferred. Confirm civilian clear. Confirmation came from 3 nodes she had never met in person. Axle lock granted. Civilian clear verified. Non-lethal window 32 seconds. Kowalski nodded to her team. Mag clamps. On my mark. The station rotated half a degree against predicted pattern. Zethkai boarding armor, calibrated for static deck geometry, lost footing just long enough for human crews to seal 2 pressure doors and vent a corridor segment into capture netting rather than open vacuum. Boarders were pinned, disarmed, and transferred under guard to medbays where triage teams treated concussion, fractures, and stress collapse without asking lineage rank. The tactical effect was small on a galactic chart. At corridor scale, it was decisive. A contested spine became an evacuation artery again. At Nadir Gate, Captain Joseph Hayes commanded what the registry still listed as a civilian salvage tender. Under Lantern Grid authority, his vessel and 14 others executed a maneuver no Zethkai simulation had prioritized. They did not defend the station core first. They cut around the flanks, latched onto 3 disruption buoys, and dragged them into intersecting sensor cones where human signal teams could reverse engineer their pulse cadence in real time. 1 buoy detonated its self-scrub protocol. 2 were captured intact. Joseph Hayes sent his report to Earth Luna without embellishment. Captured devices confirmed gene lock spectrum assumptions invalid for mixed populations. Recalibrating counterfield transmitters now. Estimated deployment to Kestrel in 48 minutes. Elena Hayes read the line and allowed herself exactly 1 slow breath. The Zethkai had built suppression architecture around hereditary clustering. Humanity's genetic diversity, insulted for decades as dilution, made that architecture less reliable under operational pressure because there was no clean biological key to seize at scale. A primary consideration in war, she had once told cadets, was whether your enemy understood your structure or merely your stereotypes. Carl had mistaken one for the other. She opened the fleet command channel. All Lantern Grid nodes, this is Hayes. Nadir recovered disruption hardware. Counterfield patch is propagating through mesh now. Expect partial restoration of long-range synchronization inside 1 hour. Full restoration by staged sectors after validation. Maintain extraction priority. Do not chase prestige kills. Keep civilians moving and keep your logs clean. Replies came from hundreds of points, many from voices the Concord would have dismissed as peripheral labor. A dock mechanic on Oathline confirmed patch upload. A refugee convoy led from Protectorate Mirren reported lane stabilization. A hospital barge captain requested escort on Vector 9 and received one from a customs cutter that had never fired weapons until today. A sharp triple chime cut through the channel traffic. Kestrel operations pushed a live dispatch. Outer docking fires contained, command beacon still in human hands, evacuation columns moving through Spine 4 under escort. Seconds later, nadir gate flashed green on 2 external rings, followed by a medical board update. 83% of protected corridors reopened, triage throughput rising above catastrophe projections. Oathline arrived as a harsher feed. Industrial sections still burning, but core habitats remained powered, and loss curves dropped beneath the red threshold as convoy timing tightened. Parallel threat markers stayed lit across all 3 targets. Zeth-Kai assault pockets entrenched, dangerous, and mobile. Yet the projected decapitation collapse still had not materialized. Then the archive transmissions reached the Zeth-Kai rear sectors. The first public break came from a mining world listed in Imperial census as Labor Basin 12. For generations, its population had been told their quotas sustained the benevolent order that protected them from chaotic species. At 311 Concord Standard, Basin Foreman received authenticated footage from a Zeth-Kai Purge Bureau, showing transfer trains rerouted from resettlement to atmospheric disposal. Attached were ledger entries signed by Carl's predecessor and audited by officers now commanding active fleets. Within 30 minutes, ore shipments halted. Within 50, local security detachments refused to fire on workers demanding independent verification. Within 70, a relay tower carrying Imperial propaganda loops went dark and came back online broadcasting tribunal evidence instead. Rel saw only the operational consequences. Fuel tankers from rear depots missed departure windows. 2 reserve marine transports reported mutiny risk among coerced auxiliaries from subject worlds. His adjutant presented the data with horror held under discipline. Prefect, morale disruption is no longer localized. Human archive packets are circulating through civilian channels faster than we can suppress. Some contain command signatures from bloodline officers currently in service. Then, jam all civilian channels, Rel said. We attempted broad-spectrum denial. It interrupted our own logistics requests and beacon coordination. Human packets rerouted through treaty emergency frequencies we do not control. Rel slammed a fist against the rail. There must be a command node for this. There are many, the adjutant said. That appears to be the point. At Concord Central, Carl convened a war chamber with bloodline admirals, doctrine ministers, and the legal custodian who had spent 20 years constructing the Empire's legitimacy briefs for neutral audiences. The chamber looked ceremonial from outside, Blackstone and lineage banners. Inside, it sounded like fracture. The Human Archive release is forged contamination, said Grand Minister Vorith. We issue immediate null declarations and classify all mirrored files as neurotoxic disinformation. The legal custodian, a thin Zeth-Kai elder whose survival depended on precision, answered without deference. High Commander, null declarations may reassure loyalists, but the packets include unredacted officer biometrics and shipboard timestamp chains that match our own public campaign records. If we call all of it fabricated, we implicate our current command authentication protocols as compromised. That damages fleet trust. One admiral snarled. Fleet trust is already damaged. My second carrier line waited 6 hours for fuel that never launched because Labor Basin 12 stopped loading. Carl stood at the center table, claws spread on an illuminated map where human corridor systems now pulsed with stubborn stability. His voice remained controlled, but anger had thickened it. You are describing administrative turbulence as if it were strategic reversal. We still hold numerical superiority in heavy hulls. We still possess bloodline command unity. We still have Earth inside eventual reach. The elder legal custodian held his ground. With respect, command unity assumes information control. That assumption is degrading. Subject populations are seeing evidence of policies previously compartmentalized. Some of our conscript cadres are seeing it as well. The prevailing narrative of corrective stewardship is under direct challenge from our own records. Carl turned his head slowly. Are you advising concession? I am advising adaptation, the elder said. Seal atrocity archives, isolate compromised officers, offer amnesty tiers to coerced auxiliaries, and open monitored inspections to neutral observers before humans define the legal frame permanently. The room went still. An amnesty tier meant admitting coercion at scale. Neutral inspections meant surrendering doctrinal secrecy. For the bloodline elite, both options tasted like heresy. Carl made his choice with a cold finality that tightened every jaw in the chamber. No inspections, no amnesty language. Issue directive black crest. All rear sector relays are to prioritize military traffic and purge unauthorized mirrors. Arrest local administrators who halt industrial quotas. Any auxiliary unit questioning bloodline legitimacy is to be disarmed and reassigned under direct officer watch. We do not negotiate our own foundations because primates found old footage. He looked to the admirals. Corridor fronts will be reinforced, not reduced. Prefect Rel receives 2 additional assault groups and authority to seize neutral depots if dockmasters obstruct. A doctrine minister hesitated. Seizing neutral depots may trigger wider Concord intervention. Carl's crest lifted in contempt. They did nothing when we moved. They will issue statements while we finish. The meeting fractured into orders. Some officers bowed and left with restored certainty. Others bowed because ritual required it and carried out commands with a new stiffness that did not escape notice. Rel received Black Crest orders at Kestrel while reviewing casualty walls that had become uncomfortably human, in scale. Names stacked beside call signs instead of rank casts alone. The reinforcements were real. So were the constraints. Lower fuel, noisier channels, and growing uncertainty about which rear nodes would still obey by next cycle. His first officer, younger and bred from a loyal combat line, spoke with fierce conviction. Prefect, we should intensify and break them now. They are still fragmented. Rel watched live feeds of human vessels he could not categorize by doctrine, each one switching roles from ambulance to escort to interdiction platform without waiting for central approval. Fragmented was no longer the right word. Multifaceted was closer and more dangerous. They are not fragmented, he said quietly. They are distributed. The officer frowned, as if the distinction were academic. Rel forwarded new assault vectors anyway, consolidating his remaining Marines for a coordinated strike on Kestrel's command lattice hubs, then rerouted one reinforcement group toward Nadir to prevent full restoration of human relay cohesion. It was a regrouping plan, harsh and mathematically defensible, built to recover initiative before logistics entropy turned tactical success into strategic erosion. On Earth Luna, Hayes watched Zethkai icons compress into tighter formations, and knew Carl had chosen escalation over recalibration. Barrett read the intercepted Black Crest summary and set it down with measured care. He doubled down, she said. Hayes nodded. He had to. His system cannot admit error without admitting fraud. Cooper brought up fresh archive analytics. Rear sector unrest is spreading, but not yet self-sustaining. If we keep proof flowing and keep civilians alive at the front, the pressure compounds. Hayes looked from the map to the rotating image of Earth beyond armored glass, then back to the corridors where ordinary crews held lines that empires had assumed they would abandon. Then we keep both moving, she said. Rescue and memory. Let him regroup. We are done fighting the war he prepared for. Hayes's order rippled outward, while the command wall recalculated itself around it, and Cooper felt the first real shift when a narrow gray indicator appeared beside 19 neutral systems at once. It was not a weapons alert. It was a legal state change. "Ambassador," he said, already pulling the packet to main view, "the dormant infrastructure covenants are waking." Olivia Barrett moved beside him, scanning the dense treaty syntax with the speed of someone who had spent half a career preparing for a day most diplomats believed would never come. The clauses had been buried 2 centuries deep in shipping accords, famine relief guarantees, and anti-piracy logistics compacts that humanity had funded, staffed, and then quietly left in place when everyone else moved on to more visible politics. Each clause looked administrative. Together, they formed a strategic architecture. Cooper stepped back from the operations rail as the text expanded. "How far does it reach?" Barrett did not look up. "Concord-wide if enforcement holds. Fuel depots built under human stabilization grants cannot service active extermination campaigns without voiding insurance shields and docking indemnity. Repair yards, operating on our emergency financing, must freeze military priority queues for forces classified under Article 84 hostile designation. If they violate, their bonded reserves collapse and every trade partner can seize collateral." Cooper gave her a hard stare. "In plain terms." "In plain terms," she said, voice level, "Carl's spearheads can keep fighting only as long as they run on momentum. Their logistics spine is now legally toxic to anyone who touches it." Cooper sent the activation burst. Across the command wall, system after system changed color as neutral authorities received synchronized legal notices, checksum keys, and pre-cleared arbitration rulings from Concord legal engines that could no longer pretend quorum delays. The silence of 3 days had built this. Not one threat, not one speech, but a grid of obligations suddenly enforced at the speed of light. By the end of the next operational hour, the first consequences arrived. At Port Vale, in the Merchants of Pax Zone, Dockmaster Hiron watched 2 Zethkai cruisers slide into approach Lane 7 with thermal signatures hot from sustained combat thrust. Their transponder priority codes still carried bloodline authority markers that had intimidated ports for generations. Hiron's station manager looked ready to collapse. "They are requesting emergency deuterium transfer and hull patch teams," the manager whispered. "If we refuse, they may board." Hiron kept 4 claws pressed on the desk so they would stop trembling. "If we comply, our indemnity vault disintegrates in 36 minutes and every creditor in 4 sectors strips the station to frame metal." A new alert chimed. "Human covenant enforcement. Automatic adjudication complete." The ruling was stark. Service prohibited pending de-escalation. Human emergency escort available upon request. Hiron swallowed and opened an external channel to the lead Zethkai captain. "Bloodline vessel Karast. This port cannot provide military service under active hostile designation. You may dock for crew medical stabilization and life support replenishment only. Weapons maintenance, reactor fuel transfer, and targeting system calibration are denied by Covenant law." The captain's answer was a roar through the translator. "You trade insect, you exist by our patrol arcs. Refuel us now or we seize your tanks and catalog your species as an obstructive caste." Hiron's frills flattened with fear and fury. "Captain, seizure triggers automatic lien capture by 26 signatories and summons Concord enforcement escorts already in transit. You will not leave this port with fuel. Decide whether you leave with wounded." The line snapped shut. 7 minutes later, 2 human escort frigates translated into the outer lane and took quiet station above Port Vale, with transponders bright and weapons cold. They did not issue threats. They simply existed where everyone could see them, and the Zethkai cruisers, after a long standoff, accepted medical docking under protest. Rel received that report while trying to force momentum at Kestrel and understood, with a sinking clarity he had been resisting, that tactical aggression had outrun strategic fuel. His adjutant listed 3 more denials in clipped tones. Neutral yards at Talrin, Asa, and Mireth report Covenant lockout. 2 attempted seizures failed when local insurers froze station command privileges. 1 depot commander opened internal gates to human legal observers rather than risk asset forfeiture. Rel's jaw tightened. Asset forfeiture is an accounting phrase. It is now a warfighting phrase, the adjutant said. On Earth Luna, Hayes watched Zeth-Kai vectors lose coherence as forward groups began rationing burns, canceling flanking arcs, and clustering near whatever maintenance they could still coerce. Carl had wanted immediate domination. Instead, he had created a fleet posture that bled options every minute. Capability reveal completed, Cooper said quietly, though no one in the room used theatrical language aloud. Their rear can still manufacture. Their front can no longer trust access. Hayes answered without triumph. Then keep pressure disciplined. Cornered formations make reckless choices. The second shift began with no announcement. It emerged in the behavior of people who had been told for days that survival required retreat, and had rejected the premise. At Kestrel, Lieutenant Anna Kowalski moved through Dock Spine 4 with a slate in one hand and a magnetic breacher in the other, assigning firing arcs between a tug pilot from Oathline, a retired customs inspector from Nadir, and a Valari structural engineer who had refused evacuation because nobody else understood the spine's old expansion joints. None of them wore matching uniforms. All of them checked each other's seals and repeated the same protocol phrase before the next push. Lane integrity first. Lives first. Capture when possible. A wounded Zeth-Kai Marine was carried past them on a grav stretcher toward triage, flanked by 2 human medics and a LUM volunteer translator. The Marine stared in disbelief as the same defenders who had disarmed his unit stabilized his breathing and tagged him for transfer under prisoner protections. The Velarii engineer clicked mandibles in confusion. Why preserve enemy combatants while under assault? Kowalski looked at the sealed blast door ahead. Because we are not trying to become them. The engineer held her gaze for a beat, then tightened her harness and nodded once. Understood. Mark me for breach support. At Nadir Gate, Captain Joseph Hayes coordinated 37 civilian hulls in an orbit ballet that looked like panic to anyone trained in bloodline doctrine and resolved on close analysis into exact timing. Salvage tenders towed debris into decoy fields. Maintenance skiffs projected false heat blooms to draw Zeth-Kai fire off evacuation vectors. Hospital barges rotated on staggered thrust, so no single volley could lock all docking ports at once. Joseph opened a system-wide channel, not to inspire but to synchronize. All corridor vessels, this is Nadir coordination. You are seeing heavier probing on rings 2 and 5 as enemy groups test for fatigue. Stay with your assigned windows. If you lose comms, execute your last valid route and pass authority to the nearest certified node. Nobody waits for perfect conditions. We move what we can, when we can, and we keep moving. A freight captain answered with dry irony that cut tension without denying it. Copy, coordination. Another calm day in civilized space. A few strained laughs flickered over the net. Then engines burned in unison, and the next convoy got out. 2 days into continuous engagement, Allied hesitation began to crack in visible ways. The scholars of LUM opened 3 archive sanctuaries and began mirroring evidence packets under their own seals, making suppression exponentially harder. The keepers of Knoll dispatched unarmed legal monitors to corridor hospitals and announced that attacks on marked medical ships would trigger universal censure mechanisms most powers had dismissed as symbolic until that moment. The merchants of Pax, never sentimental and never careless, published a list of covenant-compliant routes and ensured every ship carrying refugees or tribunal evidence at reduced rates backed by emergency human guarantees. Barrett watched those decisions accumulate and understood the underlying dynamic with crisp precision. Human resolve had not persuaded through rhetoric. It had persuaded through behavior repeated under fire. Protect civilians first. Keep records clean. Distinguish architects from conscripts. Treat law as infrastructure, not ornament. Carl tried to answer with fear. His broadcast to subject worlds was long, contemptuous, and sharpened by strain. For 6 millennia, ordered civilizations have carried lesser species through the dark while parasites fed on stability and called theft compassion. You now witness such parasites in their final convulsions. Humans distribute falsified atrocity archives because they cannot win honorable war. They hide behind mixed labor swarms because they cannot produce true command stock. They bribe neutrals with debt traps and call it diplomacy. Hear me with hereditary clarity. Any governor who withholds quotas, any dockmaster who denies bloodline fleets, any auxiliary officer who repeats human contamination narratives will be stripped, tried, and erased from civic memory. Submission restores your place. Doubt destroys it. The speech hit worlds already watching authenticated records with Zeth Kai signatures and burial scans. In some sectors, governors obeyed out of terror. In others, compliance frayed. At Labor Basin 12, workers who had halted ore lines 2 days earlier organized watch rotations around relay towers and refused to restore quota throughput unless neutral inspectors arrived. At Relay Moonchesk, an auxiliary navigation corps locked its own command center and demanded amnesty recognition for coerced personnel. At 3 minor military depots, quartermasters falsified maintenance reports to delay reinforcement launches they no longer believed were lawful. Rel saw all of it reflected in his shrinking options and called Carl on hardened command channel with the care of a predator approaching a larger predator in pain. Hi, Commander. Forward pressure can continue, but decisive breakthrough at current consumption rates is unlikely without secure fuel and repair corridors. Rager compliance volatility is raising failure probability across reinforcement timetables. Recommend consolidation at Vanta Crown, where we can anchor heavy hulls, restore targeting lattice integrity, and force humans into open engagement under conditions less favorable to swarm tactics. Carl's silence lasted 4 breaths. You recommend retreat, he said. I recommend concentration for decisive strike, Rel answered. If we keep scattering force across corridor attrition, we trade prestige for depletion. On Earth Luna, Hayes received intercept fragments of the exchange and studied the map where Zeth Kai icons were beginning to bend toward the same gravitational crossroads. The Vanta hyperlane crown sat like a locked gate between outer approaches and earthward traffic, dense with sheer eddies and old navigation hazards. In bloodline doctrine, it was considered a throne position. Hold Vanta and you dictated tempo. Cooper expanded predictive overlays. If Carl accepts consolidation, he can still field a brutal mass at Vanta. He will frame it as purification through decisive battle. Cooper kept his eyes on the projections. Can we avoid that engagement? Hayes answered immediately. Not if we intend to end this with enforcement instead of another ceasefire cycle. He will keep burning quarters until his command myth collapses or is broken. Barrett looked from one face to another and then to the map, voice calm, almost austere. Then we should choose where and how it breaks. Turning point came as data, then as motion. Human mesh commands, now reinforced by captured counterfield tech, and Covenant logistics dominance shifted from reactive rescue to controlled interdiction. Modular task groups stopped merely surviving boardings and began severing Zeth-Kai assault pockets from each other with precision strikes on propulsion and comm relays. Neutral ports, backed by legal monitors and human escorts, denied rearmament across a widening belt. Rear sector unrest forced Karl to divert internal security assets that should have gone to the front. By the third operational cycle after Covenant activation, the balance had tipped in ways no bloodline simulation had forecast. Zeth-Kai units still hit hard in local engagements. They no longer hit together. Hayes stood on the command platform while the operations wall marked the shift in quiet colors. Kestrel stable, Nader stabilized, Oathline contested but holding. Enemy reinforcement velocity down 42%. Human evacuation completion above target across all primary corridors. For the first time since Karl crossed the marker lines, human command was setting the sequence. She opened a direct net to every human task group and every allied observer ship carrying Concord credentials. This is Admiral Elena Hayes. Effective now, Lantern grid transitions to Iron Lantern phase. Civilian extraction remains mandatory priority. Secondary tasking expands to theater shaping and isolation of hostile concentrations, moving toward Vanta Crown. Engage with proportional force. Disable where feasible. Capture command assets whenever practical. We are ending this campaign in law and in fact. Acknowledgements poured back, steady and unadorned. At Kestrel, Kowalski heard the order while sealing another corridor and felt exhaustion settle deeper into bone without touching resolve. At Nadir, Joseph Hayes rerouted his civilian flotilla to open a clear lane for incoming interdiction craft and then swung back to shepherd one more medical convoy. At Port Vale, Dockmaster Hiron authorized emergency berths for 200 liberated captives and signed the manifest with a shaking hand that did not falter. Across Concord channels, species that had mistaken human patience for fragility watched the strategic picture invert, not through one superweapon, not through one speech, but through synchronized discipline spanning diplomats, medics, engineers, militia crews, insurers, archivists, and admirals who treated obligation as a combat multiplier. Karl chose his answer before the cycle ended. He recalled dispersed bloodline elements, ordered full concentration at the Vanta Hyperlane Crown, and announced to all command echelons that the next engagement would be final, exemplary, and unforgiving. Every remaining dreadnought under hereditary banner received the same directive. Assemble for annihilation strike against Earth approaches, break human cohesion in one blow, restore rank geometry by force. Hayes watched the enemy mass begin to form at Vanta and gave no speech for history. She issued deployment vectors, reserve release codes, and legal notices for surrender windows that would remain open until the first irreversible strike. The map narrowed to one crown-shaped knot of stars where both doctrines would meet with no more procedural distance left between them. Human fleets moved to intercept in layered silence, and the war that had started with contempt now had coordinates for judgment. At the Vanta Hyperlane Crown, starlight looked broken. Gravitic shear bands curved through open space like transparent rivers, distorting signatures and bending range calculations by fractions that became death at battle velocity. Karl had chosen it for the same reason bloodline academies had praised it for centuries. Only rigid formations with centralized targeting discipline could hold shape inside the Crown's turbulence. And rigid formations were what the Zeth-Kai believed they did better than anyone alive. From the bridge of his flagship Ascendancy of Teeth, he watched his dreadnought lines lock into ceremonial geometry. Black hulls edged in white rank filaments, each ship nested inside hereditary command lattices designed to punish improvisation and reward obedience. Strike Prefect Terran Rel stood one tier below the command dais, helm under his arm, reading updates that were clean enough to steady the room. Rear sector riots had not stopped, but internal security had sealed 3 relay clusters. Fuel was constrained, not absent. Auxiliary morale was unstable, but bloodline crews still held discipline. It was, by Zethkai standards, sufficient for an exemplary execution. Carl keyed the all-fleet channel and spoke with the deliberate cadence of doctrine. Bloodline commanders, you stand at the hinge of history. For 6,000 cycles, order has endured because we chose structure over sentiment. Humanity has mistaken administrative trickery for parity and contamination for strength. They gather now believing numbers and noise can erode lineage. They are wrong. We will strike once, break their corridor myth, sever Earth approaches, and display every captured hull before the next Concord session. Hold formation. Trust rank. Purge disorder. Across the crown, human transponders appeared in fragmented clusters, then vanished, then reappeared with contradictory mass profiles. To Zethkai tactical logic, it looked like the same undisciplined swarm behavior that had bloodied corridor fronts without ever delivering a decisive fleet engagement. Carl saw scattered courage and prepared to crush it. On the command deck of the human flagship Resolute Meridian, Admiral Elena Hayes watched the same picture and saw timing windows. Her operations pit was quiet except for readouts and short acknowledgments, each officer speaking only what the next person needed. Olivia Barrett stood at the diplomatic console with surrender notices queued in every major trade language, and Marcus Cooper monitored legal telemetry tied to immutable combat logs. Nothing about the room signaled panic. Nothing about it signaled haste. Hayes opened the fleet net, her voice level enough to disappear into procedure. All Iron Lantern elements execute crown sequence. Decoy wings phase 1, Vector Ash and Vector Cinder. Cyber cells hold until Zethkai lattice commits target harmonization. Mass driver groups fire control remains propulsion and relay nodes only unless hostile fire enters protected corridors. Rescue tenders remain under blue lane shield and do not break assignment. Surrender windows are active now and stay active until irreversible strike criteria are met. She paused while confirmations stitched across the display from line captains, militia controllers, customs cutters, and reserve admirals who had remained invisible to enemy intelligence for months. For 2 centuries, we have been patient with empires that called extermination governance. We hoped they would choose restraint. They chose eradication. Today, we end their capacity to choose it again. The first exchange looked lopsided by design. Human decoy flotillas burst from dark drift and irregular vectors, broadcasting exaggerated reactor signatures and command beacons modeled on capital hull profiles. Zethkai dreadnoughts pivoted into pursuit lanes precisely as predicted, heavy lances charging to erase what their analysts believed were exposed spearheads. The decoys did not run straight. They crossed into a narrow gravity-sheared corridor charted by human survey teams and dismissed by Zethkai doctrine as tactically unusable for mass movement. In that corridor, targeting solutions bloomed with elegant certainty and then slid off by tenths of a degree, enough for full volley misses at extreme range. Rel saw the error propagate and shouted correction orders before the first salvos finished firing. His crews responded with textbook speed, but correction required reharmonizing the bloodline targeting lattice, and reharmonization required opening secure synchronization ports for less than 3 seconds across 16 command ships. That was the window Cooper's cyber saboteurs had been waiting for since the 4th day of silence. Human intrusion packets, seeded weeks earlier through compromised logistics firmware and dormant treaty maintenance links, activated in sequence. They did not explode systems. They did something crueler to a hierarchy built on uncertainty. They introduced authenticated delay. Target priorities duplicated. Firing permissions arrived out of order. Identification tags froze for 2 heartbeats and returned with stale geometry. On Carl's tactical wall, bright doctrine lines fractured into unresolved amber. Lattice integrity degraded across 2nd and 4th bloodline groups. Rel reported, disbelief fighting training. We are receiving valid locks and invalid locks with identical command signatures. Carl's crest flared. Purge and reroute through flagship authority. Attempting, Rel said. Flagship authority queue is saturated. That was when the mass driver lances opened. Human capital ships previously screened behind decoy clutter and sheer distortion released kinetic salvos and disciplined waves aimed not at reactor cores or life support spines, but at propulsion hubs, maneuvering vanes, and long-range relay arrays. One Zeth Kai battle carrier lost thrust and spun broadside alive but dead in the water. Another kept hull integrity and lost half its communications architecture in 12 seconds. A third took a lance through its aft vector ring, vented plasma into hard vacuum, and drifted into its own formation with all weapons still powered but unable to track. At 14:07 Crown Time, 3 minutes into committed engagement, the first Bloodline Admiral transmitted a surrender query to Carl's flagship and received no channel slot. At 14:09, human rescue tenders threaded blue lanes through active fire and began collecting escape pods from both sides, broadcasting ship-by-ship medical status in public view. At 14:11, 2 Zeth Kai cruisers attempted flank withdrawal and found their burn paths closed by mine-free interdiction grids deployed by civilian-tagged human engineering craft that had arrived under medical escort. The galaxy watched live because Hayes had ordered every combat log mirrored to Concord observers in real time. Carl understood he was losing tempo, then position, then narrative. He gave the only order bloodline culture recognized at that depth of crisis. All units, commit annihilation pattern. Ignore decoys. Burn through center mass toward earthward vector. We break their spine now. His fleets obeyed. They surged toward the central channel of the Crown, engines flaring through unstable shear, and met empty space where human center mass had appeared seconds earlier. The signatures were ghost scaffolds, brilliant and false. Real human formations emerged behind and above them from dark transits Zeth Kai strategists had declared mathematically inaccessible due to Crown turbulence and fuel penalties. Humanity had spent 2 centuries mapping those transit eddies in merchant tables, rescue routes, and anti-piracy patrol charts nobody bothered to classify as military doctrine. When the reserve fleet arrived, it arrived in silence and perfect spacing. Gunmetal hulls, cold running lights, weapons already aligned on propulsion clusters, and command relays. Rel stared at the board and felt the old Academy maxim collapse in his chest. Impossible approaches had become operational corridors because humans had never accepted the premise that a map finished when an empire stopped looking. 19 minutes since first irreversible strike, his adjutant whispered, voice raw. High Commander, we are encircled. Carl did not answer her. He screamed across every surviving channel for line stabilization, for hereditary honor, for one final concentrated burn. Some ships tried. Most could not. Their lattice was blind, their drives crippled, their refuel options exhausted, their rear sector support fractured by revolt and lockout. One by one, then by squadron, Zeth Kai commanders transmitted weapon-safing codes to preserve crews and avoid pointless atmospheric disposal when drifting hulls eventually fell into inhabited gravity wells. The Crown filled with disabled giants, shattered formation markers, and thousands of small rescue craft moving with relentless professionalism through fields of wrecked doctrine. Hayes watched the surrender signals begin to cascade. Mark every compliant hull for tow and medical, she said. Any ship still firing gets propulsion disablement only unless civilians are threatened. Keep the tribunal chain intact. On Carl's flagship, power flickered as 2 human lances clipped the outer maneuver ring and left Ascendancy of Teeth alive, armed, and immobile. Escort ships that should have died around him instead lost engines and drifted into a tightening sphere of human interdiction craft. Boarding warnings pulsed over external speakers in Zethkai military code, then again in Concord trade speech. "Hi, Commander Carl," the translated signal said. "You are surrounded and without strategic mobility. Safeguard your crew. Stand down weapons and prepare to receive boarding parties under Concord War Crimes Authority." Carl ripped the receiver from its cradle and hurled it across the bridge. "No pure sovereign receives terms from mixed carrion." Rel looked up at him with a face carved from grief and exhaustion. "Hi, Commander. Our honor guard can still fight corridor by corridor. It changes nothing." "It preserves rank," Carl spat. Rel held his gaze for 2 long seconds, then keyed his own command circuit. "This is Prefect Rel. All surviving units under my code. Cease external fire and preserve life support. Medical access is authorized for wounded regardless of lineage. Repeat, cease fire." Carl turned on him with open fury. "You break bloodline command." "I preserve bloodline survivors," Rel said quietly. "There will be witnesses either way." The bridge lights cut to emergency amber as human breaching charges detonated in controlled sequence along the flagship's dorsal locks. Not a single explosion touched reactor shielding. They were surgical, measured, infuriatingly restrained. Pressure doors sealed. Internal gravity staggered and returned. Carl's honor guard snapped into defensive posture around the command throne, rifles trained on the smoke-filled entry corridor, while boarding alarms counted down to hull breach. The first human team entered, low and fast, armor matte gray, identification beacons bright, weapon discipline exact. They fired suppressive pulses that shattered rifle mounts and scorched deck plating around boots without punching through chests. A second team sealed side corridors and deployed stasis foam at 2 choke points to prevent crossfire into crew stations. A third team cut weapons power from the bridge hardline and locked helm control under external override. One Zethkai guard charged with a shock blade and was dropped by a non-lethal kinetic burst that spun him into a console. 2 more hesitated, saw 3 human rifles already centered, and placed their weapons down in ritual order. The rest followed, one at a time, every surrender captured by floating evidence drones that projected timestamp and biometric overlay into the live record. Carl remained upright against the command throne, breathing hard, claws bloodless on the armrests, eyes fixed on the boarding team leader striding through the last of the smoke. Admiral Elena Hayes removed her helmet and handed it back to her sergeant. The bridge went very still. "Hi, Commander Carl of the Zethkai," she said, each word landing like a legal seal. "Your campaign is over. By Concord law and human jurisdiction, you are under arrest for genocide and aggressive war." Carl bared his teeth. "No pure sovereign can be judged by mixed vermin." Hayes did not raise her voice. "Purity is not sovereignty. Accountability is." He lunged then, not far, one desperate step with a ceremonial sidearm half drawn. A human marine caught his wrist, twisted the weapon free, and drove him back against the throne with controlled force, while another locked restraint bands around both forearms. Carl struggled, hissed, spat a string of cast invectives into Hayes' faceplate housing, then froze when he realized the bridge displays had switched to external feed. Every ring of the spiral Concord, every neutral observer ship, every subject world still linked through damaged relays could see him pinned, disarmed, and alive. Hayes leaned closer by a fraction. "You will stand trial with records intact. That is more process than you gave your victims." Carl's shoulders heaved once. The defiance in his eyes did not vanish, but it changed shape, from imperial certainty to the first hard edge of comprehension. He was not dying in battle myth. He was being catalogued. Rel stepped forward under guard and placed his own sidearm on the deck. "Prefect Terran Rel," he said to the nearest evidence drone, voice formal despite the tremor. "I surrender surviving forces under my authority and request medical priority for critical casualties." Hayes nodded to a medic team waiting at the hatch. "Granted. Full protections apply." Within 26 minutes of the first breach, Carl was shackled, biometrically verified, and transferred through a secured corridor to a tribunal carrier under combined human and Concord legal custody. As he passed the outer airlock, he twisted once toward the viewport where disabled Zeth-Kai dreadnoughts drifted under tow, and human rescue craft stitched bright lines between them. "You did not win honor," he said hoarsely to Hayes. She watched medics load wounded soldiers from both species into the same triage shuttle. "We did not come here for honor. We came for an end." Behind them, across the Vanta Crown, Zeth-Kai command relays fell silent in sequence as surrender codes propagated through the last active bloodline channels, and the battle that had been announced as annihilation closed with the Empire's architect alive in restraints and his fleet disarmed under the eyes of the galaxy. The first order after surrender did not concern trophies, patrol routes, or speeches. It concerned water pressure in damaged life support loops, triage capacity by species physiology, and whether frightened prisoners would believe the corridor signs marked medical bays instead of processing pens. On the tribunal carrier Halcyon Ledger, Admiral Elena Hayes stood beside a transparent operations wall where disabled Zeth-Kai hulls blinked amber undertow and listened while doctors argued calmly about anticoagulants that worked across incompatible blood chemistries. A Marine captain approached with a sealed tactical slate. "Admiral, we have confirmed full targeting solutions on 6 Zeth-Kai Gene Vault worlds. Defense grids are degraded. Strategic strike option remains open if Cabinet wants permanent denial." Hayes read the slate, then turned it so the captain could see her own signature block as she locked the recommendation. "No sterilization strikes. No infrastructure collapse attacks against civilian continuity systems. Issue this theater-wide and mirror to Concord observers. We dismantle cast engines and war capacity, not species viability. Any commander who confuses those will answer to me before they answer to a court." The captain nodded once, relief and discipline meeting in the same expression. "Yes, Admiral." Across the bay, Strike Prefect Terran Rel sat on a medcot with restraint bands removed, left shoulder braced, honor markings scorched away by bridge smoke. A human nurse adjusted his respirator mask and checked pupil response, while a LUM translator rendered each instruction in formal Zeth-Kai command register, so he would not mistake care for humiliation. Rel watched 2 stretchers pass, one human engineer with burns along both arms, one Zeth-Kai gunner unconscious from decompression shock. They were routed to the same surgical queue by severity, not uniform. He looked up as Hayes entered the ward perimeter. "You spared the vault worlds," he said, voice rough. "My command staff expected retaliatory extinction." Hayes folded her hands behind her back. "Your command staff mistook us for a mirror." Rel held her gaze, then glanced toward a nearby evidence crate where his surrendered sidearm rested in a numbered field sleeve beside Carl's ceremonial weapon, both tagged for tribunal chain. "I gave surrender codes because further resistance was waste, not gratitude." "Waste reduction counts," Hayes said. "Your code ended external fire fast enough for 8,000 evacuation recoveries. That will be entered with your statement. So will everything else." 3 days after Vanta, Port Vale received its first convoy of liberated civilians from former Zeth-Kai labor basins. Dockmaster Hiram stood at berth 9 with trembling frills and a tablet full of customs protocols he had rewritten overnight under human legal guidance. No banners flew, no triumph music played. Human escorts held perimeter while Valerii med teams distributed thermal wraps and merchants of PAX clerks processed identity restorations from corrupted caste registries. Ambassador Olivia Barrett arrived with Marcus Cooper carrying 2 hard cases handcuffed to their wrists. One held the original convocation transcript where Carl had demanded fear. The other held mirrored archive keys, including the burial scans and purge ledgers Carl had called forged contamination. Hiram touched the cases as if they were unstable reactors. "Do these go straight to the tribunal vault?" he asked. Cooper nodded. "With checksum witnesses from Paxlum and Knoll, no single state can alter them now." Barrett looked down the berth where former captives stepped onto neutral decking and paused in disbelief when nobody shouted ranks at them. "You asked for protection under covenant lockout and held the line when refusal could have ruined your station. Today, your indemnity reserves are restored with Concord guarantee, and your port is designated permanent refugee corridor." Hiram blinked hard, then signed the designation with a claw that shook only once. At the reformed Spiral Concord, Carl's trial opened in the same chamber where he had staged the humiliation, but the architecture no longer favored spectacle. Evidence arrays circled the dais in open view. Translation fields displayed source metadata beside every clip. The legal custodian who had once advised Carl against denial testified under oath, then surrendered internal doctrine memoranda, proving extermination language had been administrative policy, not battlefield excess. Carl chose to speak in his own defense after rejecting 3 counsel strategies. "You have built a court from diluted sentiment," he declared, bound at wrists but upright, voice carrying to every tier. "Hierarchy is nature. Purity is governance. You call conquest aggression because you are too weak to rule what you inherit." The chamber remained silent until Chief Arbiter Seelan of the Scholars of Lum nodded to Barrett for final prosecution statement. Barrett stood without notes. Her uniform was unchanged from the convocation, including the small pin where her badge had once hung, before she set it on a war table and never wore it again. For 2 centuries, humanity participated in this concord under rules often enforced unevenly against us and rarely against those who threatened weaker neighbors, she said. We were told courtesy meant consent, restraint meant fragility, and diversity meant defect. We still honored treaties. We built ports everyone used, hospitals everyone trusted, and legal covenants people ignored until they needed them. You asked what we fear most. We fear becoming comfortable with extermination described as procedure. We fear records buried so deep that children inherit lies as history. The defendant is not charged for contempt, insult, or defeat in battle. He is charged for policies signed, fleets directed, civilians erased, and truth suppressed by design. The evidence is complete. The witnesses are alive because force was used with restraint when annihilation was available. Judgment now is not revenge. It is maintenance of civilization. Carl laughed once, sharp and brittle. Mixed vermin writing destiny. Selin's response was measured and final. Verdict on all major counts is guilty. Sentence is permanent extra-dimensional confinement under multi-signatory lock, no command access, no public platform, monitored life support, and continuous archive linkage to the record of those he ordered erased. The sentence transmitted in every major trade language within minutes. Cooper personally verified each checksum mirror, then logged the final packet beside the old warning broadcast and the first battle reports from Kestrel, Nadir Gate, and Oathline, so no revisionist could sever cause from consequence. By the second week of ratification, the Concord floor filled again, this time with delegates holding actual drafts instead of threats. The anti-eugenic statute passed with binding enforcement clauses, inspection rights, and automatic sanctions that no quorum could indefinitely delay. Zeth Kai military hulls were disarmed under monitored autonomy accords, and subject worlds voted through supervised transitions for self-governance charters, written in local languages first and Concord legal script second. Rel appeared remotely from supervised custody to address one such vote on his home orbital. I was trained to believe rank absolved architects and condemned only the disobedient, he said. That doctrine failed every test that mattered. If you choose civilian continuity without hereditary coercion, I will testify to all command structures that made refusal deadly. No one cheered him. They listened, then voted. 6 years later, cadets from 16 species stood in the Vanta Memorial Archive, a ring-shaped station built where the Crown's shear band still bent starlight. The final gallery contained no statues of victors. It contained artifacts with context, a captured disruption buoy with engineering notes explaining why it failed against mixed populations, Carl's ceremonial sidearm tagged surrendered at time and coordinate, the 2 evidence cases from Port Vale, and Olivia Barrett's convocation badge mounted beside the transcript of silence that had lasted 3 days and changed strategic doctrine for a century. Admiral Hayes, retired and gray at both temples, served as guest lecturer that cycle. She stood before the cadets with her hands resting on the rail and watched them read the old question on the wall. "What does your kind fear most?" A young Valeri cadet answered before being called. "Fear itself." Hayes shook her head gently. "Fear is ordinary, useful even. The real failure mode is amnesia with weapons. Your institutions will always be tempted to call cruelty efficient and call delay weakness. Study this campaign closely. We did not win because we were angrier. We won because civilians were not abandoned, records were not falsified, and law was treated as load-bearing structure under stress. When we could have erased a species, we dismantled a doctrine. That distinction is why this chamber is a classroom instead of a bunker." After lecture, Olivia Barrett met her at the viewport where rescue ships now cross the Crown on routine lanes marked by blue corridor lights. Hiron's granddaughter, now a certified dock arbitrator, supervised one convoy. A Knoll legal monitor floated nearby with a tablet and no bodyguards. 2 former Zeth Kai worlds had sent scholarship cohorts this term under the autonomy accords. Barrett held a small replica pin of her old badge, turning it between finger and thumb. "They still ask me why we stayed silent." Hayes watched the convoy clear the shear band and enter open dark with engines steady. "Because we were deciding what justice would look like before we used force." Barrett nodded. "And now?" "Now they have the record," Hayes said. "Memory did its job." Outside, the Crown no longer resembled a throne position. It looked like a crossroads under shared rules, busy and unremarkable in the way peace became when maintained on purpose.